The views expressed are solely those of the speaker and not necessarily those of Paltalk.com, AVM software, or its advertisers.
Talk is online. News Talk Online is a production of Paltalk.com, the largest multimedia interactive program on the internet, with more than 4 million unique users on demand on iTunes and on YouTube. And thanks to our good friends at CRN Digital Talk Radio, well, you can hear us on cable. And 12 million households do hear us on cable thanks to CRN Digital Talk Radio. We're going to get right to the calls very quickly today. Our guest is, thanks, I haven't introduced you yet, Aaron. Aaron Klein from WorldNet Daily. Hey, Aaron. He is the Jerusalem Bureau Chief, and he wrote a great book called Schmoozing With Terrorists, because his beat takes him into the Gaza, takes him into the West Bank, takes him into the homes, really, of the various terrorists, and he interviews them. And he's a great friend to this program, and we're glad to have you back, Aaron. And you found something very shocking as you were interviewing terrorists about other issues. You found out that they had a strong interest in the outcome of the presidential campaign here in the United States. How did that come about?
Yeah, indeed. And sorry about interrupting before. I could barely hear you in the beginning of the broadcast, but now I could hear you. Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I talk with terrorists on a regular basis, as some of your listeners might know, because I've been on this program before. I report from Israel, and a lot of terrorists, they like to get into the media, and so they call me quite often to take credit for different attacks that they carry out against Israel, against U.S. interests. And so last week, like usual, my phone rang, and this time it was a terrorist. His name was Abu Odai. He's a senior leader of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which is basically the most active Palestinian terror group, and he was calling, as he usually does, to take credit for an attack against an Israeli soldier. But this time, while I was on the phone with Abu Odai, he asked me about, very strangely, asked me about Ron Paul, the Republican who is running for U.S. president. He said, "Who is this Ron Paul? He sounds good." Well, it turns out that this terrorist, Abu Odai, he was actually watching Al Jazeera earlier in the week, and they had a whole feature on the American elections and the U.S. primaries, and they described Ron Paul accurately, because this is what he is, as against the war in Iraq, as against using American military intervention in the Middle East. And so this terrorist, who is also against the war in Iraq and is also against American military intervention in the Middle East, he was kind of curious about who this Ron Paul was. I told him, of course, that Ron Paul is a Republican, and after that, the terrorists didn't really like Ron Paul too much, because the terrorists, and I talk to them on a regular basis, as I said before, they have a very black and white view of American politics. They think Democrats are good, or a little bit better for them, I guess, because they see, I guess they saw Bill Clinton, who was in office for 8 years, didn't do much about Al-Qaeda, had Yasser Arafat, the godfather of modern-day terrorism, as the most frequent visitor to the White House, and they see that the Republicans, they get very black and white, as strong on the war on terror, something I don't agree with, but they think they saw President Bush invade Iraq, invade Afghanistan, declare this so-called war on terrorism. So they don't like Republicans. They don't like any Americans, Republican or Democrat, but they like the Democrats a little bit more. And what was brought home to me in my conversation with Abu Odai, the terrorist who called asking who this Ron Paul was, is that these terrorists, our enemies in the Middle East, they are paying attention to our news cycle. They're watching the Al Jazeera, they're reading Arabic news, and they're paying attention to the political debate. It wasn't just this one terrorist. I wrote a whole book on this, Schmoozing with Terrorists, where I talked with dozens, literally dozens of senior terrorist leaders on the record, and I was kind of stunned by how closely they were paying attention, indeed, to the primary debate in our American news cycle.
Well, let me get this straight, and I don't suggest to anybody that they vote for or against a certain candidate, whether or not, based on the endorsement of that candidate by a terrorist. But I am very interested in knowing what the terrorists think about our political process. And I've got to surmise from this whole discourse about Ron Paul is that since Ron Paul is viewed as the anti-war candidate in this campaign, unambiguous. If I'm elected president, says Ron Paul, the first thing I will do as commander-in-chief is bring our boys and girls, our men and women home. That's Ron Paul's position. So I'm just wondering if it's safe, Aaron Klein, to make this quantum leap, and that is that they would view the terrorists, a withdrawal of the U.S. troops from Iraq and presumably Afghanistan, as a victory for their cause.
Oh, well, you don't have to make any quantum leaps. I can quote, I don't know how many terrorists I have talked to. Just one, Jihad Jarrah, who's a leader of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, just talked to him recently, and he said that a withdrawal from Iraq would be a victory for the revolutionary movements in the Middle East, meaning, of course, for the terrorists. And I'll tell you, because these terrorists, they don't just want to get America out of Iraq. They don't just want to get America out of Afghanistan. Their goal is not just to destroy Israel. These are just their short-term goals, their long-term goal, and they're very open about this. If you just talk to a terrorist, they will tell you it's to spread their brand of Islam in the Middle East, in Europe, and ultimately in the United States of America. So indeed, the terrorists themselves are very open about their goals, and they do view a withdrawal from Iraq, a withdrawal from Afghanistan, destroying Israel, all of these short-term things, as furthering their long-term goal, which is spreading their belief system around the world.
Yes, this is Aaron Klein. He is the Jerusalem Bureau Chief for WorldNet Daily, and he has written a fantastic book called Schmoozing with Terrorists. We've had him on before. I highly recommend that you read the book because he's an amazing story, because as part of his duties as the Jerusalem Bureau Chief, he crosses over into the Gaza, into the West Bank, and he actually interviews terrorists on a regular basis. He's been in some very dicey situations, and for some reason, they like spilling their guts to him. God knows why.
Well, I'll tell you, these terrorists, they like spilling their guts to anyone who would listen. A lot of people, they would constantly ask me, like, how do I get these interviews? Well, I'll tell you, I just call them up and say, hey, can I interview you? And they're very happy. I wish other reporters out there would do their jobs and talk to the terrorists as well, because these terrorists will talk to any reporter, Jewish, Christian, Catholic. They love talking to the media. I think a lot of times it's the media, it's the New York Times, it's CNN, even sometimes Fox News, that presents the terrorists for something that they're not, that presents terrorists as having legitimate grievances, or that they're blowing themselves up in response to occupation, or that terrorism is about pieces of territory, that you have the Palestinian terrorists and they're just looking to get back, as they say, their territory. You have Hezbollah, which just wants a little piece of the shut-off arms. You have the insurgents in Iraq that are just looking to get America out of Iraq. And that's a lot of the view of what we get from the American media. But I wish the New York Times and others would actually just pick up the phone or go over into the West Bank or to Sadr City and talk